Let's go to Psalm 90. Psalm 90. Although God lives outside of time, 2 Peter 3:8, God invented time. The evening and the morning were the first day, we're told in Genesis. The length of time it takes for the earth to rotate on its axis, one time, is one day. The number of days that it took God to create the world and have a day of rest is 1 week. The amount of time that it takes for the moon to orbit the earth is 1 month. The amount of time it takes the earth to orbit the sun is 1 year. Life is measured in days and years. Moses wrote Psalm 90. Therefore, it is the oldest of the Psalms, probably about 500 years older than most of the Psalms. It's the only psalm that Moses wrote. Thought to have been written at the time when God had given the decree that that generation that had been brought out of Egypt would not be allowed to go into the land of promise because of their faithlessness. 10 spies came back, said it is a beautiful land, a land that flows with milk and honey, but there are giants in the land. We cannot take it. Joshua, and especially Caleb at first, we are well able to take it. Let's go. And the people listened to the voice of the 10, rejected the voice of the 2. And God said, the children and wives that you said would be a prey, and you will die in the wilderness, but your children that you said would be a prey will be allowed to go into the land of Egypt 1 generation from now, 1 year of wandering for every day of spying out the land. 40 days equaled 40 years. So that generation wandered around. Numbers 14 is where that judgment was passed out. And as far as I can tell, there's no record of 38 of those 40 years. They just wandered around in circles having funerals. If you figure up the number, it was about 100 funerals per day on average that they would have had in order for all that generation that was numbered at the beginning of the book of Numbers to be buried by the end of the book of Numbers. Can you imagine being Moses preaching 100 funerals a day? He had a perspective on death that no other preacher ever had. He had a perspective, therefore, on life that no other preacher ever had. How short it is, how precious it is, and how valuable it is. You will not preach 100 funerals, most likely, in your lifetime, but you will preach funerals. You will preach funerals of the old who have lived their days 70, sometimes by reason of strength 80 years. I have preached a few funerals of those who were almost 100 years, but eventually the record of their life reads, and he died, or and she died. For it is appointed a man once to die, and after this the judgment. Hebrews 9:27. Now, what happens between your birth announcement and your death announcement is what we're here to talk about, and how you will use those days. So far, God has made about 250,000 days, as far as I can tell. If you live a full life of 70 years, you will have about 29,000 days. How will you use those days? Really, that's an illusion, though, because the first 5 years of life are spent in our infancy. We're not accomplishing anything toward our life's goal in those preschool years. The next 12 to 16 years are spent under tutors, as Paul says, Galatians 4:2. And we are not really at our own discretion to choose our actions during those years. We may choose where we attend school, but we are going to do what the teachers and the administrators require of us, and so we're not accomplishing a lot in those 16 years. So the 70 years now is down to about 50 years. Take into account that you will be asleep in your lifetime about 16 years. You really only have 34 years to accomplish all that you will accomplish in life. And that is assuming that you will live to be the full 70 years, and many do not reach that number. Moses is teaching us in Psalm 90. We're going to begin in verse 9. There's a lot about God's wrath in this psalm because he's writing about or to a people who were facing the wrath of God because they had disbelieved in God's power to give them the land. But he's also helping them to see that there is light at the end of the tunnel. There's hope at the end of the storm. And they could still be saved, and there was still a purpose for the people of God. And from this psalm, we learn a lot of lessons that help us to value our time. Let's begin in verse 9. For all our days are passed away in thy wrath. Contextually, his anger because, as we've seen, of them being unwilling to take the land. We spend our years as a tale that is told. How long does it take to tell a story? A few minutes, a little while. Has a beginning, has a middle, has a conclusion, has a punchline. How long does it take to live a life? Well, in a manner of speaking, it's like a tale that's told. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it comes to a conclusion, and sometimes a rapid conclusion. And so therefore, verse 10 tells us the days of our years. Let's read this entire verse, and then we'll come back and observe 4 ideas here. This will be a sermon if you need a sermon for Sunday about time. Well, let's read it, and then we'll pull out 4 ideas. The days of our years are 70, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Point number 1 in this verse, life's outer limits. 80 years, or if by reason of strength, 80 years. There are 2 ideas about what this part of the verse means. Contextually, it most likely means that generation in the time of Moses had a shelf life of 80 years. That was the absolute most. Anybody who heard Moses preach this sermon or read Moses' psalm would live. When you go back to the early history of man, men lived much longer than this. Genesis 5, the table of nations, you read down through that list of names, and Adam lived 930 years, 912, 905, 910, 905, 895, 362, 962, 969, I think would be the list. And you average those out, leaving out Enoch, who did not die, 857 years. That's a long lifetime. Almost 9 centuries of life. You continue reading Genesis, and you come to Genesis 10, the next list of names and numbers, and you find that they no longer lived that long. The average in Genesis 10 is 323 years. So 500 years difference between those 5 chapters. Some would attribute that to the flood and the changes in the atmosphere, perhaps the water vapor canopy that no longer was above but was in the oceans, no longer protecting man as before from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. That may be the case, but for some reason, men were not living as long in the second table of nations, Genesis 10. But still a long time, 323 years on average. Then you go to the last half of the book. I say half because the natural division of the book, Genesis 1 through 11, man's early history, Genesis 11 through 50, the history of Abraham and his descendants. There are 2,500 years covered in the book of Genesis, but about 2,000 of them are covered in the first 11 chapters. It's like when you take a rock and you skip it across the top of a lake and it just hits every so often. That's the way the first 11 chapters of Genesis are. It's just taking the high points of human history in those first couple of thousand years, and you see that this happened and that was important in the ongoing history of the world, and then this other event occurred, and then this one, and it goes by really fast, and then it slows down when it gets to Genesis 12 and talks about Abraham and his son, grandson, and great-grandson, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and you have 4 consecutive generations, but they didn't live as long. Abraham lived 175 years, Isaac 180, Jacob 147, and Joseph 110 years. So now you're down to an average of 153 years. 857, 323, 153 years. So it's down but still living more than 100 years. Those are long lifespans. You continue reading throughout the Old Testament, you soon get to the period of the kings. David lived. It's easy to date the Old Testament by the primary characters. Adam, 4,000 years. Abraham, 2,000 years. Well, if you wanted to put Noah between Noah. So you've got 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, Adam, Noah, Abraham. And then Moses at 1,500, David at 1,000 years BC. And then the end of the Old Testament era at about 500, 400 BC. So 500-year intervals if you just know those characters and when they lived. And so now you're down to the time of David, the time of the kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul lived to be 72. David lived to be 70, maybe 71, depending on whether his birthday fell in the half year that he was king or in Hebron before he became king over all Israel. So 72, 70. Solomon lived to be 60. He began reigning at age 20, reigned for 40 years, so he died at 60. So now you're down to the lifespan that we are familiar with, the 67 years if you average those three lives together. So what does Moses mean then when he says the days of the years of our lives are 70 He may mean that the people who were living at that time were only going to live for 70 or 80 years because the punishment of God was upon them. Within 40 years, they would all be dead. So if someone was 20 years old at the time that decree was given, his maximum lifespan would have been 60. If he was 30, his maximum lifespan would have been 70. If 40, then 80. If he was over 40, then he was going to die earlier in those 40 years of wandering, and then no one would live to be above 80 years old. But how we usually use this psalm, and I think accurately so, is that not only did it have an application to the people who were living then in that generation, but also, generally speaking, mankind is going to live about 70 or 80 years. The average lifespan now worldwide is 71. The average lifespan in America, 78.8. Women outlive men in every nation on average. Women in our country live to be on average 81 years and men 76 years, but you're right in that same range of 70 to 80 years. Now when you consider that lifespan, life's outer limits, if you wanted to say, I'm standing on the early part of my life, looking out into this audience, I would say most of you are under 30, some closer to 20 than 30, some of us a little beyond that. So you have more years to live than you have lived if all things hold as we expect them to, and the Lord delays His coming. I remember on my 43rd birthday, which happened to fall on a Sunday, and I preached that day, it dawned on me for the first time that I might have lived more years than I would live. My dad died at 66. And that was an awakening. And you get to the point where life is not going to go on forever. And we don't realize that soon enough. Often, that's one thing we're going to emphasize as we go through this series, is that your life is valuable and every day of it is valuable. Whether you're 25 or 75, it's of equal value. But we don't see it soon enough in many instances, and we squander the opportunities that God's given us. Here we have 70 years to do what God wants us to do. When you look at that 70 years, from one perspective, the perspective of youth, it seems like a long time. It seems like there are so many years to go that it hardly matters at this point to give it much thought. I have plenty of time. And in some ways, it is a long time. It's longer than the lifespan of God's other creatures by and large. A horse lives to be 30 years. A mule can live to be 50. An elephant, 70 years. An eagle, 20 years. A raven, 17 years. A squirrel. Anybody have any idea how long a squirrel? I had no idea. I looked it up. A squirrel can live to be 18 years old. Teenager squirrels seem to be a connection there, probably. A bee can live to be a year, a butterfly year. Now, each of those serves their purpose in God's ecosystem, His food chain, that matches what God needs that creature to live. But we don't just live a year. We don't just generally live to be 17, 18, 30, or 50. We have a longer lifespan. So it's a long lifespan compared to many of the other creatures that God made. It's also a long time to be tempted and tested. Just over lunch, I was thinking about this point and pulled out my phone and calculated it. You know, if you're tempted on average 10 times a day, would that be an unfair assessment? Probably more times than that, many days. Let's just make it easy with the math. 10 times a day times 365 days times 70 years. That's 25,000. Somebody do that math. I think I wrote it down somewhere. Is that 250,000 temptations that we will have to face? That's a lot of times to say no to the devil, isn't it? So it's a long time to battle Satan. It is a long lifespan. But if you wanted to look at it from the other perspective, from the perspective of youth, 70 years, life's outer limits, that's a long time. But from the perspective of the gray hair, it's such a short time. And that's the perspective that I'm hoping to give to you in this series. This first lesson is entitled Putting an Old Man's Head on a Young Man's Shoulders. Have you ever heard the adage, youth is wasted on the young? You know, if I could go back and live my life again, how many people have said, I would do it differently? If we could see from the old man's perspective time, from the young man, during the young man's years, how many better decisions would one often make? And so we are wise to be able to take God's Word and say, this is what it's teaching me. This is what God has given me. And now I have the opportunity to see it when perhaps others of my generation and my contemporaries it hasn't dawned on them yet what God is allowing me to see because I respect what He has to say. So it's a short period of time. It's a short period of time, number one, in order to accomplish all that we want to accomplish in life. If we're going to accomplish much, it's going to take time. You know, you can grow a weed overnight, but if you're going to grow an oak tree, it's going to take decades. If you're going to have a life that matters, a life that leaves a mark, it's going to take time. And not weeks, not months. It's going to take years, and sometimes it's going to take decades to get this work off the ground, to even for other people to know it's there. And then for it really to blossom and grow and be fruitful, it's going to take a long time. I mean, this school, how long did it take before it grew from just a few to what we have today? A lot of years. You take a congregation, often will begin with just two families, meeting in one of their houses or maybe a storefront downtown. And for 5 years, it just maybe trickles and grows a little bit. By the end of 5 years, maybe they've got 25 members. Maybe some of the congregations where you preach, that's the history, probably most of them, where I preach. But then over time, and because of God's providence and the hard work and the preaching of the gospel, it's grown from 25 and then to 50 to 100 and maybe to 200 members, maybe more than that, but it takes time. So life is short from the perspective of accomplishing all that we want to accomplish with our lifetime. A lot of people have gotten to the end and said, oh, I wish I had more time. I could have done so much if I had more time. And often that regret is because they did not start to be serious about their life's work until they were middle-aged. It's also a short period of time to prepare to meet God in judgment. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says that we are to be made into the image of Christ. That's a gradual process. We should look more like Christ, spiritually speaking, the second year of our Christian life than we did when we came up dripping out of the waters of baptism. We should have more in common with Him at 5 years, much more than at 5 months, at 10 years than at 2 years, and at 25 years, certainly so. But you know what a challenge it is. Even if you've been a member of the church for a quarter century, would you say that I'm like Christ? I can check that box off? No. Even at 50 or at 75 years, by comparison, we have much to do. And so one lifetime is a short period of time to be able to prepare to meet God in judgment. Ephesians 5:25 to 28 talks about the marriage relationship, but it's really an illustration of the church. And a part of that teaching is without wrinkle and spot. If you had been invited to, let's say, the presidential inauguration, you were going to meet the president-elect, or if you would prefer one of the previous ones. The day comes, the limo pulls up in front. Before you go out, you would look in the mirror carefully. Is my tie? Does my tie match? Is my shirt wrinkled? If you have a spouse, would you make sure that anything? My hair okay? You'd want to be without any mistake because you're going to meet someone important. That's the way Judgment Day is. But He's not going to be looking at our clothes or our complexion or our hairstyle. He's going to be looking at our souls. How much like Jesus are we? How loving, how kind, how courageous, all the characteristics that were a part of His life are to be a part of mine. And so 70 years is a short time to prepare for that test, and that's the point. The days of our years are 70. By reason of strength, they be 80 years. That's life's outer limits. But let's see also in this text that we're also shown life's common experience. That's the next phrase. Yet is there strength, labor, and sorrow. It doesn't matter what your background is. You may have grown up in the mean streets of a big city. You may have grown up at the end of a dirt road in the country. You may have pulled for one team or a different team. You may have one personality type that differs completely from the person who's sitting beside you or in front of you. You may have been athletic. You may have been an academic. You may have grown up with a proverbial silver spoon in your mouth, or you may have wondered where your next meal was coming from sometimes. It really doesn't matter about those things. We all share some things in common. By the sweat of our brow, we earn our bread. We all understand what it's like to make mistakes, to fall on our face, to be embarrassed. All of us share in common that we have fallen short of the glory of God. All of us stand in common need of a Savior to wash away our sins and to add us to His body and to restore hope within us. You see, life has many common experiences, and this text says that labor and sorrow are two of them. Life is not meant to be easy. It's going to be hard. It was hard for Adam, the sons of Adam. It was hard for every Old Testament character that's listed in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Fame. It was hard for the apostles. It was hard for the early Christians. It's hard for your teachers. It's hard for your parents. It will be hard for your children. Life is meant to be a labor. And it has its sorrows. Nobody gets out of this world dry-eyed. I'm looking into the faces of many who have not yet buried your parents, I suppose. Grandparents, maybe. Those are times when the tears will flow. You will preach funerals sometimes when you will fight back the tears because you love that elder whose body is before you and who is beloved of the people who've gathered to remember his life. This widow sits here. She'll go home to an empty house. His children have come in from afar, and Dad won't be there for Christmas this year. Life is full of labor and sorrow. Now, that's not all negative, though, because this world is not my home, is it? If this world was where I intend to be forever, well, it would need to be a lot better than it is, wouldn't it? This world leaves something to be leaves something lacking and something to be desired. And so it makes us want to go to heaven, because there we can be reunited with our loved ones who've gone on ahead of us in Christ. There we want to have temptation. There we want to have tears. There we want to have the things that make this world sometimes a bitter land of sorrow. So there's life's common experience. And really, whoever it is that you talk to, whatever audience it is you stand before, they're all going to be able to relate to this point. Just like you've been nodding as I've been talking about this. Some of you smile. Some of you think, how did he know that? Because we all know that. It's part of life. It's life's common experience. Number 3 in this text. You have life's sudden end. That's the next part. For it is soon cut off. Soon. The word cut off can be translated mowed, as you will mow a field. It could be translated sheared, as you would shear a sheep. Some of you will not be old enough to remember this. Anyone remember cassette tapes? How about VCR? Thanks, Don. Okay. Anybody remember a VCR? Maybe some more of you will remember that. Yeah. Anybody remember renting VCR movies? Yeah. Okay. You remember those stickers they put on there? Please be kind, rewind. Or if it was a meaner guy, it was don't be fined, rewinds. You start rewinding a cassette tape or a VCR tape. And at first it goes really slow. Then it gets in the middle, it goes a little faster. What happens when it gets to the end? That's the way life is. It starts off, it seems like it's going really slow. In the middle, it's going pretty fast. Here we are at the end of this year. It seems like just about a month ago we had the New Year's celebration, right? I mean, this year's gone by fast. And then toward the end, it goes by really fast. Here we are, some of us at different places on that rewind. Some, it's going pretty slow right now. Others, it's picking up speed, and some of us see it coming fast. Life's sudden end, it will end too fast for many people. I remember reading of Cecil Rhodes. He was a British philosopher, many things really. I'll give you just a little bit of background real quick. He was born in England, but was a sickly child and was sent to Africa, where he thought the climate would be better for him. At age 17, age 18, he entered into the diamond mining, a diamond mine, working for a company. Within 20 years, he had worked his way up to where he was the dominant force in the diamond industry. He founded De Beers Diamond Company, which now more than 100 years after his death is still one of the major world corporations in that field. When he died at age 48, he said, "So little done, so much to do." But did you know that in addition to being a diamond magnate and extremely successful businessman, he founded a nation, Rhodesia. Now it's Zambia and Zimbabwe split. He was the prime minister of that nation for 6 or 7 years. He laid the groundwork for the first railroad between the Cape and Cairo. He funded, you ever heard of a Rhodes Scholarship? More than 100 years later, his estate is still funding that scholarship for students all over the world. So little done. By any measure, any metric, you would say that was a successful man. But he died saying so much to do. It came too soon for him. How long will you live? How do you know? Maybe you have 50 years left. Maybe you have more. But maybe you have 50 days. Or 50 minutes. We have no guarantee. You can go on the internet and look up a death calculator. You ever done this? Seems a little morbid, but it's sort of fun. I did it. So far, I've lived about 17,000 days. You know, the first part of this verse, the days of our years are 70. That's an odd way to say that, isn't it? He could have said the days of our lives or the years of our lives, but why say the days of the years of our lives? Because life is handed out in days, but it passes in years. When we want to know about someone's chronology, what do we say? How old are you? What answer do we expect? I'm 17,000 days old. No? We expect them to say I'm 12 or 29 or 65 years old. But you can't live life a year at a time. You're going to live it a day at a time because that's all it's given to us. According to the death calculator, I have 12,000 days left. I will die on August 17th, 2050, which is the Wednesday before PTP will begin that year. It's probably a good time. At the age of 84 years, 3 months and 23 days. But they don't know. How long will you live? Will it be to 84 or 48? You see, whenever it comes, it will probably come suddenly, but you'll be soon cut off. It will at least seem sudden to those who love you and wish you were still with them. The fourth point in this text, we find life's final transition in the final part of the verse, and we fly away. We sing about that, don't we? I'll fly away. You see, this life is not all there is. This life is a training ground for somewhere else, and there's a transition between one and the next. Angels came to take Lazarus, Luke chapter 16, to Abraham's bosom. So we have faith that we will live beyond this world and that really we'll live longer somewhere else than we'll live here. Here is a vapor that appears for a little while, James 4:14. We go to our long home, Ecclesiastes 12. When we try to put a number, put a pencil and paper to calculate the days of eternity, you'll just give up. We sing when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. 10,000 years is just as close to the beginning as the end. I mean, there's no limit to it. So there's a final transition. We will all make it. Some will make it unprepared. Some will be prepared for it. Now you continue into verse 11 and observe that this text says, "Who knoweth the power of thine anger? Even according to thy fears, so is thy wrath." Now verse 12. "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." So far what we've done is we've learned to count our days. But now we need to learn to make our days count. You can't make your days count until you can count your days because you won't feel motivated to do it. And the things we'll be talking about, time management techniques, are useless unless a person has goals that he wants to accomplish or she wants to accomplish with his or her life. I mean, if you're going to save an hour a day, which almost anybody can save an hour a day, what is the use of it if you're just going to sleep in for an extra hour, sleep 9 hours instead of 8, unless you need that hour of sleep? What is the use of it if you're just going to watch 2 more sitcoms on the television that night? What's the use of it if you're going to play video games for an extra hour that day? A person who's made in the image of God, who will stand before God in judgment, and who will have around him or her those that he or she has influenced for eternity, has bigger things to do and has a motivation to do great things with the time, with the days that have been counted, to make those days count. Napoleon is said early in his career to have been looking at a wood carving of the nations of the earth, and he took his fingernail and scratched a deep gash across it. And he pointed at it and he said, "I want to leave a mark on the world like that." What kind of mark are you going to leave on the world? Not for your glory, not for people to remember you 100 years after your death, but for the good of mankind. for the glory of the Maker of man, and for the help of those who are on this orbiting sphere with you at the same time. Happenstance, perhaps, that they were born the same time as you, in the same geographic part of the earth as you, that happened to come into contact with you as opposed to living a life and never meeting you. Perhaps by the providence of God, this circle of people that you influence can be made the better or the worse by how you use your days. BJ, let's take our break here. Would that be all right? Sure. Take a 10-minute break and come back, and we'll talk some about goal setting. I think this will be the proper time to break. So thanks for your attention.